Hey there folks, Finley here. This is a very short video introducing the idea of devised theater. So in Drama 2 and other classes, when we talk about the history of theater and we look at the different movements and things like expressionism versus realism versus surrealism, and sort of the timeline of all those different styles, a question I'm often asked is, well, what's the next style? What is the next sort of new direction in theater? And I think that we can sort of look at stuff that started in the 1970s, 1980s, and really took off after 2005 or so, and say that's the direction. We call this type of theater devised theater. What do we mean by devised theater? Well, it is theater without a playwright. Historically, the playwright in theater is the most powerful person. They have a vision, they have a style in their mind, they create a script, they give that script to a director, sometimes they work with the director, and then that is put on stage. And the visual choices that the designers bring in all goes back to that script, which always goes back to that playwright. So the playwright is the one really, maybe with the director, working closely with the director, is coming up with the style, the language, the characters, the plot, all that. The playwright is very powerful. As a playwright, I like that. However, it's not the only way to go about making theater. Devised theater, there is no one playwright who comes up with an idea and everything else flows from there. Instead, what happens is a bunch of different artists get together, and that will include maybe some writers, maybe not, actors, almost certainly, director, almost certainly, maybe designers, costume designers, set designers, visual artists. They get together, they do a series of improvisations together and discussions together, and together they create a piece. The performance arises out of their collaboration with each other. So the creation of the piece is usually improvised in some way. They may say, okay, I think it's, let's say we're creating a post-apocalyptic zombie piece, and so we spend a couple of days doing post-apocalyptic zombie improvisations to get ideas and to generate characters and things. So the creation is improvised in that way. The piece itself is not improvised. It's not like an improv show where what we're seeing on stage they're coming up with as they do it. Instead, the creation is improvised, but they are keeping track of, oh, that's a good character, that's a good character, that little scene, that works. A designer may have tried several different pieces of set dressing, and they decide it's that one that works. And so they're choosing the best elements and creating a piece, picking the various best elements out of a long process of improvisation to make the actual designs and the script and the performance. It's a long process that way because you've got so many different ideas and different people working that you have to spend time to generate a lot of improvisation, and then generate time to select what's good, and then generate time to put all that together into one place. So it's a time-consuming process, but it can lead to work that is more visionary, more varied, and more integrated between the design, the text, and the acting elements than you could in a traditional way. Oftentimes that improvisation has a structure to it because there's so much going on, you want to have some sort of box that you put around it, right? So one method is the Suzuki method that comes out of Japan. It's very much about movement in space and the body, and how that leads to the creation of ideas. Another one is the viewpoints method that Anne Bogart and City Company use. We've used some of that language when we talk in drama about shape, gesture, topography, architecture, relationship, tempo, repetition, duration, kinesthetic response. You may remember those 9 terms from Drama 1, Drama 2. That's the viewpoints method of looking at things, and it's a way of structuring that improvisation. Typically also, you have this whole group of different artists working together. There's usually 1 or 2 people sort of outside, and that person may rotate, watching the improvisation, saying, oh, that moment was really good, write that down, let's keep that. That moment was really good, let's return to that moment. We call that person maybe the editor or the director, or sometimes just the scribe, because they're just recording these ideas. They're not creating the ideas, they're seeing what's created through improvisation and recording those to be revisited later. Because you have all these different people involved in this, designers, from the very, very beginning, these shows are often very visually interesting, because the designer isn't just someone who's coming in at the very, very end to make costumes or something. They're there from the very beginning, and their visual ideas are informing the creation of the work from the beginning. So oftentimes they're visually just amazing, and oftentimes it's less about what the characters are saying than how the characters are interacting with props and the physical stuff that they're doing as well. And it also means that you can create pieces that don't just exist on stage, but that have a whole world that the audience explores that has been generated and designed from the beginning. So you have immersive pieces, or what we call promenade pieces, where the audience doesn't sit in a chair, but the audience moves through the space, sometimes just wandering at their own will. Pieces like Sleep No More, which explores the ideas of Macbeth, or Then She Fell, which takes Alice in Wonderland is the base text, and then it explores, well, what it would be like to visit Wonderland and to interact with these characters. Those pieces also can come out of this sort of immersive type of theater. As you sort of maybe got from that, oftentimes with a devised piece, there's an anchor that it starts with. We're going to devise a piece based on the themes of Macbeth, or devise a piece based on Alice in Wonderland. So everything sort of goes back to that. But then the shape that takes in terms of the characters, the visuals, all that is created through improvisation and discussion, and just throwing lots of ideas at the wall and then picking the few that actually work out of that. The process I've described, by the way, this may sound familiar to you because it's a lot of what we do in the senior arts lab, right? Devised theater, performance that draws from many different disciplines and does not start with a text necessarily and work in a linear fashion, but starts with a sort of foam of choices and then narrows down to a final product. It's a lot of what we do in the senior arts lab, and one of the reasons we've made the senior arts lab is that this movement toward devised pieces is really the big movement of the 21st century. So it should be pretty familiar to you. The last thing I'll say is that they're, unlike typical things history-wise and theater-wise, when we talk about a playwright or a composer, Stephen Sondheim or Tennessee Williams, because the work goes back to one person. Here, the work is going to groups of people, to what we call companies. And there's a few of them that are pretty famous, so you should know. One of the first ones was called Citi, S-I-T-I, and that was Anne Bogart's company. And they came up with the viewpoints term. So they're one of the first ones, the Citi company. There also is a company called Mabu Mines, sounds sort of weird, and then the Rude Mechs there in Austin. A company that you may have heard of, I know that Ms. Stokes talks about them in her creative writing class, is the Neo-Futurists. The Futurists were an avant-garde group of artists around the turn of the century, and so the Neo-Futurists takes that same idea. The most famous maybe of all of these is the Tectonic Theater Project, through their devising of work, which started with interviews, and then they chose bits and pieces of those interviews to create the text. They've made some very famous plays, including the Laramie Project, which you may have used in your design project in Drama 3, and the Gross Indecency, the Three Trials of Oscar Wilde. So they are a very famous company that does this. My favorite company that does this is called Complicité, which is a British company. Simon McBurney runs that. Very visually striking plays. Some of the most just eye-opening stuff I've ever seen on stage. There's a play called Master and Margarita, which began as this, from the 1800s, this unfinished Russian novel. It was huge, like War and Peace, but on acid. It was so crazy. And they took this unfinished Russian novel and they adapted it into an almost 4-hour piece of theater, and it was incredible. It was something else again. And then the company that you may hear about the most recently is called Punch Drunk. And they do specifically immersive pieces, like they made Sleep No More, which is the sort of most famous of these immersive pieces where you wander around this abandoned hotel. It's not really an abandoned hotel, it's a building. It's actually 3 buildings. It's enormous. It's a set. that they have built this, and you just wander through it and see. Maybe you want to follow Lady Macbeth as she's going around plotting things, and she's going to do her things no matter what you're doing as the audience. Or maybe you just want to look through the letters on this desk over here that are the correspondence between Mr. and Mrs. Macbeth. Or maybe you just want to sit down and watch the witches doing what the witches are doing. You have complete freedom to explore this space because the whole space is the set. That's Sleep No More, which is, of course, part of a quote from Macbeth if you want to be fancy about it. And that's created by Punch Drunk, which is the most famous of these currently. So those are some of the companies and ideas and the importance of devised theater. Thanks.